talking about DevOps, what is confusing and what was confusing for me as well is people talked about a lot of different things. So people talk about tools, the practices, the culture, and that confuses the hell out of people, really, right? Because when you start talking about DevOps, and when I want to start implementing some of these practices or tools, I don't know where to start from. Or because somebody says, hey, this is about culture. Somebody says, hey, no, you have to use this tool, and then you're doing DevOps. Or somebody talks about a completely different principles or practices, right? To tell you frankly, DevOps is all about everything that we talked about, including the culture, including the practices, including the tools. However, you have to look at it from your restricted perspective, and only then it would make sense to you, right? Because I get to meet a lot of people who are mostly the practitioners, mostly like developers or the operations guys or the QA, and they mostly say that, hey, I'm a practitioner. Somebody told me that DevOps is all about making this cultural change. I can't even, have a control over making a cultural change in my organization, which is true, right? So you don't have to care about that because that's not for you. And that's why I've broken it down into 3 different components. One is at the organization level. Second is at the team level. Third is at the practitioner or individual level. If you are an executive, you might want to care about the culture because you can drive the cultural change and you don't have to worry about the tools there, right? But if you're a practitioner, if you're a developer or operations guy, you don't have to care about any of these. Forget about the culture, forget about the practices. You need to care about the skills. Skills like configuration management, the automation skills, the automation tools, the cloud, and so on and so forth, right? And that's what brings us to how do we actually strategize and what should we be looking at, right? So if you're an organization, if you're an executive, you need to be focusing on building a customer-centric organization with a cross-functional team, not overly functionally dependent organization. You're the one who's going to initiate the DevOps culture, and you need to have a belief in automation when you start that journey, because a lot of this journey depends on the automation practices and tools that you create, right? Now, if you're a team lead, if you're a technology leader, you need to start creating your own strategies based on some of the practices that we're going to talk about, like value stream mapping and then the theory of constraints and so on. You need to start making architectural changes as well. And that's when microservices architectures, the loosely coupled architecture, and the implementing like NoSQLs and using some of these new technologies and tools will come into play. Now, you also need to start incorporating operations in your agile methodologies, make them part of your team, either by inducting operations in your team, building cross-functional teams. So there are multiple ways of doing that. And if you're an individual, you need to care about just the skills. And that's very important because you need people who actually implement this, you actually make changes happen, make things happen. And most of the skills are related to the automation, right? So there's continuous integration and infrastructure as a code, cloud, and so on and so forth. It's getting really loud. Can you hear me at least? Yeah? All right. Now, what are the principles that you could start practicing, right? One is, so there are 3 main principles we talk about when we talk about implementing DevOps, and that's how we get started actually, right? So that's the path that we take. First is the systems thinking. Second is amplifying feedback loops. Third is continuous improvement. Now, what do you mean by that, right? We're going to look at each of this. We're going to talk about first 2 actually, systems thinking and amplifying feedback loop. And that's the most important aspect. System thinking is when you look at the big picture, your flow, right from when you start planning your work till you actually deploy it in production. You come up with your workflow, you do the value stream mapping, and then you start thinking about how do you reduce the waste. Now, what is the waste in IT organization? Waste is when you are waiting for environment to be set up. Waste is when you are, doing things which you are not, you don't need, you're not going to use in production, right? So you're going to reduce all this waste. You're going to elevate the bottlenecks by applying the theory of constraints. And your goal is to improve the flow. And flow, in case of DevOps, translates to the lead time. So how long it take from the development to go to the production is your typical lead time, and you come up with the workflow, right? So you start planning your work to coding to pre-production, and that's just an example workflow. It is a context-based approach, so we talk about the principles. How do you translate it into your environment will depend on your workflow and your organization and your product, right? And this is a sample workflow when you start from the idea, maybe given by the customer requirements, and then you plan your work, then you start development, and then you go through the continuous integration and so on, right? And that's when we talk about systems thinking, and then you start doing this value stream mapping. So what do you mean by doing value stream mapping? This is one example of it, and that's when you start, analyzing right from your design to estimation to development to UAT to, let's say, testing to production deployment until it goes to the customer, and you identify all the tasks, you identify the work centers, you identify the engineers that you have working on those, and how long it takes for every activity, and then how long it takes from one work to other work waiting in the queue, right? And that's a non-productive work. So whatever is non-productive, you have to try and minimize that. And that's where value stream mapping is very useful. And what are the wastes? So this is where we can start comparing all these principles that we talked about from the lean manufacturing. Principles such as theory of constraints, value stream mapping, the waste, reducing the waste. And in case of DevOps or in case of software delivery, the waste is, one type of waste is overproduction. So you are either creating the features that are not required or do not add any value, or you are writing some tests and implementing those when you don't need it. So if you have a product or a feature or a service which doesn't have any dependency, you may not need to use an integration test there, right? So that's the overproduction. Waiting is the most common thing which happens in the organizations. Let's say you have developers, you have QAs, and you keep on waiting for the operations guys to deliver the environment for you. And when they deliver it, it's not exactly similar to the production, or it's quite different versions and quite different, right? So that is gonna lead to defects. So defects is another type of a waste. And then you have waste of resources. Resources can be just your memory or memory and CPUs and those system resources, or it could be your workforce, working on something that you don't require at all, right? So what we start doing is identifying the workflow, then we start identifying the waste, and then we start reducing that by using most of these automation tools and practices that we talk about, right? One tool that you definitely need is to visualize your work. So you always, before you actually analyze and before you actually start making changes, you need to know what kind of work you have. You need to look at the complete big picture, and the way to do that is to visualize your work. And one tool one methodology that lets you do that is Kanban. An implementation of Kanban is like Trello and Jira and tools like that, right? So they give you visibility into what's happening in your organization, who is overworked, who is not, where is the bottleneck, and for that you need a visualizing tool, right? The second thing that you need to do is identify your bottlenecks. Now, what could be the bottlenecks in the world of software delivery? One such bottleneck can be environment creation that we already talked about, right? And that's when you need to identify and elevate this constraint by automating the process of doing so. So one is environment creation, second is code deployments. Now, code deployments should not take any manual intervention typically. You should not be doing this manually. You should not be having deployment meetings and pre-deployment meetings, because all of this can be automated. It is predictable process and it is a repeatable process. So anything that is repeatable, predictable, you should definitely automate that process. The other is test setup and run. You could also have an overly tight architecture. Now, what happens when you have overly tight architecture? Your build does not finish on time. It's not fast. It takes forever because you have so many dependencies. It's a monolith project, and that's when you have to create or start thinking about loosely coupled architectures, right? So you can't have overly tight architectures when you want to move faster. Now, some of these are process problems. Some of these are just automation. You can just automate this process, right? So things that you can automate are definitely like environment creation. And what your goal should be as part of this process is you should shift the bottlenecks from everywhere else to your development organization. Because development, just like manufacturing design, there is a design process and then there is a manufacturing, right? So design takes time. Design is unpredictable. Design is which is creative. But once that is created, everything is predictable. And that's when you have assembly lines. That's when you have automation. Similarly, your development can be unpredictable. You might have different, it's quite dynamic. And but your deployment, your build, your releases should all be automated because that's quite predictable. So your goal should be to shift bottlenecks to your developers and it should just stay there. Developers should not be waiting for the environments to be created. They don't have to be constrained on any of the resources or any of the build process or any of that, right? That should just be automated.